Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the GALA webinar series. My name is Allison Furch, and I'm the Executive Director at GALA. GALA is a global nonprofit trade association supporting the language industry. We are headquartered in Seattle, Washington, in the United States. Today, we're going to have a presentation by John Tinsley from Iconic Translation Machines. We're so pleased each of you joined us from various locations all around the world to participate in the event. I will hand it over to John in just a moment, but first I have a few housekeeping items to go over. We have muted everyone's lines to cut down on any background noise. If you experience any technical difficulties, you can let me know by using your chat box in the GoToWebinar panel, and I will work with you to troubleshoot them. If you have a slow internet connection, your audio may be disrupted. If that happens, you can also call in using the number listed on the GoToWebinar panel using your telephone. We are making a recording of this presentation, and you will be able to find it following the webinar on GALA's website. All participants will receive a link to the recording via email. John will answer your questions at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to type them into the chat box throughout the webinar. As your questions occur, that will add them to the queue, and we'll get to as many questions as we can with the time remaining at the end of the webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to take just a moment to introduce our speaker today. John Tinsley's background is in machine translation, an area in which he earned a PhD from Dublin City University. Since then, he's focused on consulting and development of MT technology that has practical applications and provides real value to its users. The foundations of Iconic Translation Machines are built on methods that John pioneered over almost a decade of research. His ongoing development and innovation in this area ensures that Iconic Translation Machines will continue to deliver cutting-edge translation technology. So now, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to John for the remainder of this session. John, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Alison. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me on the GALA webinar series again. Good afternoon or good morning to everybody who's attending, wherever you might be in the world. Thanks very much for signing up for this webinar. So today, what I'm going to talk about is, as the title suggests, the role or the growing role of machine translation in litigation and global litigation cases around the world. So how machine translation and translation technology is helping litigation, and also similar areas like e-discovery, compliance, and digital forensics. This is one of a number of rapidly growing use cases for enterprise machine translation, which is in some parts driven by advances in the technology with the advent of neural MT, but primarily it's really driven by the market demands in the legal sector. So don't worry if you're not familiar with this topic. I'll be explaining it in quite some detail over the course of the talk over the next 30 or 40 minutes. But there are probably two key takeaways that you're going to get from this webinar. The first one is that you'll definitely have a better understanding of how litigation and e-discovery work when it comes to language. And then hopefully you'll also get a sense of how valuable machine translation can be for solving this type of issue, as well as other challenges outside of the legal industry specifically. So the first slide I have here was to give a little background about myself. Alison's more or less covered that. Suffice to say that machine translation is essentially what I have done for my entire professional career, including my education. So I have an undergraduate and a PhD in this area. And then I founded Iconic Translation Machines in 2012, and we have been working obviously on this type of challenge as well as many others over those 6 or 7 years. So just to tell you a little bit about Iconic Translation Machines in a little bit more detail. So we're a translation and language technology software and solutions provider. We're headquartered in Dublin, Ireland, where I am today. We recently opened up an office in London because that's a big center of activity for this particular industry. We also have a technical team in Barcelona, But we operate globally, so our clients are based all around the world, and there's not really too much concentration in any one location, so that causes us to be a around-the-clock company. And so what we do more specifically is we develop industry-specific neural machine translation solutions for different clients and different use cases. The company has its roots in high-level scientific research. The company originally spun out from a university here in Ireland, and we have cutting-edge proprietary technology that's built by our team of experts, which results in highly bespoke solutions for our clients. And so just to talk briefly on who those types of clients are, they're anything from various multinational enterprises, law firms, government organizations, and service providers. And so what I want to do briefly before I jump into, I guess, the legal part of things is give you a sense of who some of those clients are and what exactly we do with them aside from litigation. So to give you an example here, one common application for machine translation that we're seeing really growing over the last while is customer support. So providing companies with the ability to do multilingual customer support and chat on a real-time basis to publish their help content on their web pages and in their products in multiple different languages. So that's something that's been growing quite a lot over the last while. On top of that, there is the more, I guess, in air quotes, traditional use of machine translation, which is as a productivity tool. So machine translation in localization workflows and other types of workflows to help reduce turnaround times and perhaps costs in some cases. And then kind of moving slightly more towards the legal area. So one of the first verticals that we worked in was intellectual property, so developing machine translation for patent searching and kind of companies being able to manage intellectual property on a global basis. And that is kind of what led us into the legal industry and where we came across the use case of litigation and e-discovery. So I want to now jump into kind of explain to you a little bit what that actually means. So I'm going to use the term litigation and e-discovery interchangeably when that's not quite accurate, but it's not too far off. So just to explain a little bit about what litigation is from the legal perspective. So you have company A and they're suing company B. And so the law firm representing company A goes after the law firm who are working with company B, and company B is forced to hand over documentation, information, because company A is trying to find out, trying to prove that company B did something wrong. And so once company B hands over all that information, company A carries out what we call discovery. So discovery is the process of essentially trying to find the smoking gun, trying to find the document within the big set of documents that kind of proves the case. And this, what you see on your screen here, is what discovery traditionally looked like. So what you see in the movies and on TV shows where there are paralegals lugging big boxes into a room and then people essentially sifting through them. That's the traditional way of carrying out discovery. And what that has evolved into, as you can imagine, is what we call e-discovery. So increasingly, as that documentation becomes digital, so it moves from being documents on a shelf to documents on a computer, the process of discovery is online. Just like mail and email, we have discovery and e-discovery. And the challenge here, as you again, you might imagine, is that this is growing at quite a big rate. And this is part of the challenge that lawyers face. So you can see here on the graph how the volumes of data have grown year on year. And so, we're looking here at 23 zettabytes of digital data that exists online today in 2018. And this is growing at a 40% compound annual rate to the extent that it's predicted by 2020 we'll be sitting on 45 zettabytes of data. So that's 45 billion terabytes of data. So there's a scale challenge there for this e-discovery process of finding documents that are relevant to a particular litigation or a particular case. So this is how law firms and service providers deal with this information from left to right. So there'll be some level of information governance, which is the high volume case. So first they have to identify what documents there are in this collection. Is it emails? Is it annual reports? Is it spreadsheets? Is it text messages? It can be anything. Is it audio? So they have to identify that, and they have to collect it and identify things that they need to hand over, things that they don't. Once they hand it over, the other side has to do processing. They have to ingest this information. They have to review it, analyze it. Then they find which documents are relevant, and they prepare them for presentation in court or to the opposition. And so that's how you go basically from having a large volume of content on the left that covers absolutely everything to the relevant documents on the right, which in theory is a smaller set of documents that are quite specific to the needs of the client. And so this process assumes monolingual data, which is not always the case. And so when translation is required in this process, it's really a detour. So we've collected this data, we start to process this data, we start to review this data, and somewhere at this point in time, it's identified that certain proportions of this data is in a foreign language, and that's when translation comes into play. And so that's where I'm going to focus a little bit of my time on now. And so, you know, when translation comes into play, you know, the people that we're talking to on a daily basis around the globe, so law firms, service providers who service the law firms, they're all seeing an increase in the number of cases where they have to handle foreign language information. And that's reflected also in the volume of content that ourselves at Iconic are translating in this particular area. And I think this is all reflected in a Gartner report from a few years ago that stated that 80% of all litigation cases will be multilingual by 2020. And that, I guess that's, you know, it's quite stark, and it's quite a shift from what had been seen in the legal industry before, but it's not that hard to believe. I guess given the extent that borders are more fluid when it comes to business and globalization. And for example, here in Dublin, we have giant corporations like Google and Microsoft, who have offices in scores of countries around the world and massive workforces of multinational employees. So the growth is inevitable. And when you put that globalization together with the growth in digital content, the question of translation comes up in the legal industry across those different use cases. So let's take a closer look now at translation in the context of litigation and e-discovery. So first of all, when does the need for translation arise? In the first sense, it's incidental. So documents, things come up from time to time. They're relatively low volumes. It could be a mix of languages, and these are snippets of text, maybe a single document, an email, and that needs to get translated. On the other side, we have cases or bigger projects. So this could be a big litigation case. You know, if you think of ones that we've seen in the public eye recently, there was Apple versus Samsung, or there was the US government and Volkswagen. So these are examples of large cases where there might be large volumes of foreign language data, and these cases will run on and on and on for years. And so they're a known quantity because we know there's a legal case. There could be a merger or acquisition that is generating all of this content. It's typically only in one or two languages. So if you consider the Apple versus Samsung case, you can imagine that a lot of the Samsung documentation or content that needed to be reviewed was in Korean. But the other thing here is there's a large volume of files that need to be handled, translated, and processed in all imaginable formats. So that's something I'm going to talk about shortly. So when these translation requirements arise, what are the options for law firms or legal practitioners? So let's use a case study as an example. So a particular case comes into a firm in the US, and the documents contain around 300 emails in Italian. And so the goal here is to identify relevant or privileged documents to a particular case from these 300 emails. So there are multiple options here. The first and scariest option that we hear quite a lot is to do nothing with these Italian documents. Let's find the documents that are in English first, and we'll work with them, and maybe that'll get us to an endpoint before we need to handle the Italian documents. That's it's scary to hear that, but it happens more often than you might imagine. The second thing and most common thing to do is look internally to see if anyone in the firm can help with review or translation. And that's literally a case of perhaps sending an email around the firm to say, does anyone speak Italian who might be able to help me out with this? This is the second most common thing that will be done with these 300 emails. The third thing to do is look externally. So again, the eyes that we typically want when we're reviewing these documents are legal eyes, and they're the eyes of attorneys. So the third option here is to look externally. Are there Italian lawyers or are there Italian reviewers who work on a contract basis that could be hired to come in and review these documents? So that's the third option. And then the fourth option is to translate those documents and review them in English, in the native language or the reviewer. So let's look at the pros and cons of those various options, omitting the first option because it's quite clear what the cons of doing that are. So if the first option is to look look internally to see if someone in-house can help. The pros there are that it's quick and effective. If there's somebody in-house, they're going to be able to help you quickly, and they'll be able to review the documents effectively and get it done. And they'll be within your environment, so they'll understand the needs. The problem here is that doesn't scale. So if there's a larger case, the people you have internally might not be able to meet the demand. Availability is not guaranteed. So, the person who speaks Italian might be on vacation. So you just can't guarantee that someone will be able to help you out in a given time frame. And there's low coverage as well. So we find that approach will typically work for certain languages where there are more speakers. But if you have, without kind of wanting to list specific languages, clearly, if you're in the US, there's the higher likelihood that someone in the office will speak Spanish or French or German than necessarily Slovakian or Georgian or, Kazakh or something like that. So you can't guarantee coverage with that option either. So let's say we're going to go externally and contract reviewers. This is even more effective because someone is looking at it in their native language and this is their job. So that'll be quite effective. The cons there are that it's expensive. So you have to pay these folks a specific rate, which is not cheap. It's slower because you have to source these people. You have to kind of arrange the project, get the documents, get these people brought in. And so there's an overhead in terms of time. And then QA is a challenge. So basically you have to rely on the judgment of someone from outside the firm. So that's one of the cons of this particular approach. And then the last point here is translation. So again, it's quite effective because you'll get the documents translated to, we assume, a good quality, with nothing missing from the original document, and then they'll be reviewed in English. The challenge here is that this is even slower because there's a 3-step process. Number one, you have to procure the translation. Number two, the translation has to happen, and that will take a certain amount of time. And even at that point, you still haven't done the review, so there's still the review to do. But it's also expensive because you have the translation costs, and it doesn't necessarily scale as well if the volumes kind of grow quite large. And if you can scale it, there's probably a premium on the price to deal with that. And so if I look at contract reviews, this is probably the most common way that this multilingual challenge has been resolved kind of historically. But it's costly. And so this is a breakdown of, for any given litigation, the document review costs. And as you can see there, the highest cost by far is contracting in foreign speaking attorneys. So this is the most predominant approach, the most applied solution to this challenge, but it's significantly more expensive. And so the goal here is to try and see, are there other solutions that we might be able to find? And that's where translation comes in. And so when describing the pros and cons here of translation, we were obviously implying human translation. But as you can guess by the title of the webinar, that's, there are more options than human translation. And so before we kind of dig into that, let's move the goalposts on the case study. And let's say instead of 300 emails in Italian, we're dealing with 30,000 emails in Italian. And so now we definitely need translation, or we've decided that translation is the route to go. What are our options here for that? So the first option is what we'll call, for argument's sake, professional human translation. The next option is kind of free online machine translation, and the third option is what we call professional machine translation. So machine translation that's been designed for this specific task. So with human translation, the pros are obviously, this is where you're going to get the best quality. If you have kind of certified professional translators on this, you're going to get the best quality translations. The cons are that it's slower, it's more expensive, and it doesn't necessarily scale without an increase in the cost. If we use online machine translation tools, they are quick and they are cheap, and in many cases they can be free. But there are multiple cons that really preclude them from being used in the legal industry. The main one being kind of just open questions around security or data handling, data confidentiality. There is still a question around quality and what they can produce. And then there are other limitations around the file types that they can handle and how they can be integrated into specific workflows. So if we go to professional machine translation, the cons here that we're looking at is, again, it's quick. It's not cheap, it's not free, but it's more cost effective than a human translation. They're secure and more flexible in terms of how it can handle the various requirements of a case. But the question still remains about quality. So it's still machine translation, and despite the fact that it may be designed specifically for this task, there is an open question around whether the quality is sufficient. And so, for example, this was something that we always wondered about in our company when we were looking at getting into this area, as to how do we deal with, what are the implications of perhaps machine translation not being good enough? And we asked this to lawyers. Obviously, we did a lot of market research before we went out with the solution. And the most impactful answer we got by across the lawyers that we talked with, number one, they find human translation is often overkill in this case, that it doesn't need to be a perfect translation, because the task of document review and e-discovery is not an exercise in perfection. It's not a case of having a perfect English translation of those Italian documents and being able to make your point. It's an exercise in establishing a legally defensible position. So you could, in theory, go into court and say, I am taking this legal position based on this machine translation that I got from this Italian email. I'm not saying that this is 100% correct, but this is why I'm establishing that position. And that's increasingly accepted in the legal field as acceptable as machine translation technology gets more reliable, and as a way to kind of keep things moving on in cases without being delayed or held up because people are trying to get through the documents in other ways. So that was quite an interesting finding. And so basically what we have is the machine translation exists because we have 30,000 emails in Italian. By machine translating them, in theory, we're able to say, okay, actually there's 20,000 of these that are not relevant at all. So even though the machine translation we can't guarantee to be perfect, we can say that we can clearly tell this email has nothing to do with the case, because we're dealing with a case, let's say, of infringement on a copyright, and this particular email is Joe talking to Mary about the Christmas party. So you can immediately eliminate documents like that. So basically it's like a triage that helps you say, okay, we're establishing this position, we can eliminate these documents, and we move forward with these documents based on the machine translation. And so I'll give a little bit of a case study in a while, just to show you what that actually looks like in practice. But what I want to kind of jump through now is the 6 steps that we found. So I mentioned this notion of professional machine translation, what that needed to and still needs to encompass in order to kind of provide a solution that's effective for this task of litigation and e-discovery. So the first step is the machine translation technology itself. And the one thing that neural machine translation has done, like in many of the other use cases, is increased how much the machine translation is usable. So there still might be cases, because of the language, because of the content type, where the machine translation is not proving effective, but neural machine translation has had the impact of increasing the amount of times that machine translation is an effective solution. However, kind of differentiating it from the online machine translation, there are still things that it needs to be able to facilitate in order to be fit for purpose for this task. So the first one there is being domain adapted for content and style. So The vast majority of documents that we'll end up translating in any given legal case is emails. I would say probably 70% of all content is emails. So there is an informal style, and so the machine translation has to be able to handle that informal style, but as well as other documents that it might have to come across. The second thing is the ability to customize or tweak the machine translation on a case-by-case basis. So for example, if you're dealing with an Apple versus Samsung case, the terminology and kind of phrasings and key terms are going to be different than in a case involving an automotive manufacturer. So the ability to perhaps add in terms, do slight customizations, can actually be, even though they're quite small efforts, they can have a massive impact. And the reason that is because if you can imagine, again, when someone's searching or doing the discovery on 30,000 emails, they're not necessarily manually reading each one. They've got a set of key terms, of search terms, or the various other analyses that they carry out to identify documents. And so if we can do things with the machine translation that can ensure that those terms are translated in a certain way or preserved, then that can make the review process that much more effective. And so the graph that you see on the right there is from a particular case that we ran earlier in the year, translating German documents into English. We did 9 batches in total, and this was how the reviewers kind of during their task of review ranked the usability of the translation. So again, this is not the kind of the fluency or the perfection of the translations, but usability being, can I determine whether this document is relevant or not? And there were some cases where the translations were poor and maybe they had to work a little bit harder or ultimately source a human translation. But for the most part, the vast majority of documents were usable. And this is a big change. So this wouldn't have been the case 3 or 4 years ago prior to neural machine translation. There will be a lot more red in those graphs, and there will be a lot more blues that we don't see there in terms of unusable translations. The second part here is automatic language detection. So this is obviously the ability to detect the languages of a document. So as I mentioned, these guys don't necessarily know. There's a certain point that they will find out there are documents in a foreign language, and to a large extent this needs to be automated as well. So documents get run through language detection to say that, oh guys, we've actually identified here that all of these documents are in a foreign language, and then we determine which machine translation engine to send them to. But one of the quirks that I hadn't really ever seen before that we see extensively in discovery is single documents that are in multiple different languages. And this often manifests itself in email threads. So this is a snippet of an email thread here that we can see. The main body here is in English, but if we look at the quoted bits earlier in the thread, there are bits of Spanish, there are bits of Portuguese and Italian in there. And that can happen, like I mentioned, if you have increasingly globalized workforce. Your team in Spain might be interfacing with each other in Spanish, and then they'll ping someone in the US and they'll revert to English. And so that in that case, the technology needs to be able to say, this document has foreign language, and actually this bit is Spanish, this bit is Portuguese, and this bit is English. That's a really important feature and functionality that is required here as well. The third thing is information security. This is one of, aside from obviously the quality of the translation, this is probably the single most important factor within the legal industry, and it's what precludes the use of online machine translation tools. Are very specific and very case-specific guarantees around what happens with the data and where it goes from a jurisdiction perspective. So, for example, this is a snapshot. This screenshot that you see here is AWS's data centers around the world. And so, for example, in our application, the client has the ability, when making a translation request, to specify which data center the documents are processed in, and that can be really critical. So, especially within the European Union, because of safe harbor laws, documents can simply not enter the US, and there may be cases where documents have to stay within country. As you can imagine, in Europe at the moment, there's a bit of uncertainty around Brexit. And so let's say you have UK data centers set up as currently within the EU. We don't know if that's going to be still in the EU in a couple of months' time. And so the ability to say we can also process in Irish or German or French data centers is important as well. But also the ability that the clients know where the documents are, where copies are stored, if they're stored at all at any point in time, is critical. And there are still, so the ability to be able to ring fence where the translations go is very important on a case-by-case basis. In some cases, the data simply can't leave the four walls of a firm. And in those cases, we need the ability to be able to deploy the machine translation on-premise as well as a server solution. So the next thing is scale and speed. That's a critical factor with machine translation in this area. So there are three, I've put three frequently asked questions there. They might be slightly paraphrased, they might be slightly facetious, but they are 100% accurate. How long will it take to translate X number of files? Can it translate it any faster than that? Is it possible to get these translations done yesterday? These are very common requirements. So the ability to be able to, from a back-end architecture perspective, to be able to scale dynamically. You might have one user who has 1,000 documents to translate today, then the opposition delivers another 20,000 documents that they want to be able to push those 20,000 documents in and get the translations back in a known time frame. So the ability to be able to guarantee and scale to meet demand is critical as well. The next point is flexible file handling. So I mentioned flexibility earlier on, and that's something that online tools can lack a little bit. I'd never heard of so many file types until we started to work in this area a few years ago. And what we learned to do is expect the unexpected. So we currently support slightly over 40 different file formats natively. And there's a list of a few of them there. And one of the things that's often required is to be able to produce the translations in the same output format. So if someone has a German PowerPoint presentation, they want the translation in PowerPoint format with the formatting preserved, because that can be critical to being able to understand the document. And one thing that's quite common is, if you are company B and you're handing over this document, all of your information to company A, you're under no obligation to make it easy for them to sift through this. So the documents might be packaged in really awkward compressed formats, or you might have XML files that aren't completely valid, and so the systems need to be quite robust in being able to handle the variety of content types that might be thrown at it. And the last of the 6 points that I mentioned is integration. Again, one area that we don't necessarily get with off-the-shelf tools that's really important for a professional machine translation application in this particular area. So during that information governance, collection, review process, there are many tools that law firms and service providers will use, and it's important to be able to integrate into them. So one such tool is known as relativity, and it's used by probably 75% of the law firms around the world. So one of the very first things we did when looking at how we can bring something to the market for this particular challenge was to have an integration into relativity. And it's basically, I mentioned translation is a detour on that workflow that the law firms are using. So the idea is to make that process as seamless as possible. Translate, get the translation in the interface that they will be working with on a day-to-day basis, and be able to continue with the task that they were doing, but also being able to go back and review and check what they did and when. So integration is a really critical component. So there are the kind of 6 steps that we found were critical to be able to bring a machine translation. So it's not just the case of machine translation, it's how can it be packaged as a solution to resolve this problem. And so this is kind of how we summarize it in terms of the interfaces are, how can people access the translation through applications, through connectors, through managed service, and then on the back end, where do the documents get processed? Is that on the cloud, whereabouts, which jurisdiction, or is that on premise? And so it's about packaging all of that into kind of a single solution that allows clients to kind of have a one-stop shop nearly, if you will, in terms of being able to get through multilingual documents and review them. So I want to run through one brief case study of how machine translation was used in the loop on quite a large litigation case that we've been working on for a couple of years, actually. So step one is we have a law firm. It was an American law firm with a UK office. And the challenge they had at the beginning, and still have on an ongoing basis, is they had 60,000 documents in a foreign language. And I can't say what that foreign language is because it might reveal more details of the case. So, like I said, we'll review the English documents with the existing English review teams. We might have some speakers of the foreign language who can also review the documents. So this was the review team that was set up. So this law firm used a consulting firm in the UK, and they had a team of 21 English speakers and 3 speakers of the foreign language. So they have a big capability to review lots of documents in English, but the documents aren't in English yet. And they have 3 speakers of the native language, which isn't enough to be able to get through even this initial 60,000 documents. So from the translation perspective, we have both machine translation, which was ourselves deployed on site in the UK. And so what happened here is basically all 60,000 documents were machine translated into English. And what happens then is any documents that the English-speaking team, any of the machine translated documents that the English-speaking team identify as potentially important, or hot as we call them, they flag them. And so we've already limited the number of documents there. And then those documents that are flagged go back to the 3 foreign-speaking reviewers in the team. And so basically we've really filtered out from the 60,000 documents which ones that might be relevant using machine translation and the native, using machine translation and the English speakers. So then the foreign-speaking review team will review that much smaller subset of documents in the foreign language to validate or verify that a particular set of documents were relevant or not. And then those documents that they identified as being key, they were sent to the human translation partner, in this case, Park IP, who do the certified translation. So perhaps you go from 60,000 documents in the foreign language, machine translated, reviewed, second pass review in the original language, and then a much, much smaller subset of those documents, ultimately human translated, where we need to certify and stand over the quality of the translations. So that's just an example of how that kind of fits into the workflow and how machine translation combines with human translation with the document review teams to actually get to find that smoking gun and get the case resolved. So just to wrap up before we go to the floor to take some questions. So obviously I've described that the solutions in this case need to be quite flexible because there are many variables in terms of the languages, in terms of the case, in terms of the file types, in terms of where the documents need to be processed, and that will all be, no pun intended, on a case-by-case basis. The big evolution that we've seen is that machine translation is in the tech stack of most legal operatives, particularly in this area, and it's not going anywhere. So actually in the legal industry, they were quite early adopters of machine translation to try and solve some of these issues, but like I said, it didn't often meet the requirements in terms of the quality. Now that that hurdle has been surmounted, it's really kind of embedded in the tech stack, and it's not going anywhere. And one of the reasons is that, like I've described, it's often the only practical option. You're sitting on massive volumes of documents and you need to turn them around in a certain space of time. It's often the only practical option. But on top of that, it's often the best option for that as well. Because like we said, in that first instance with those 60,000 documents, there's no way we need them human translated because we're going to spend time and costs having something human translated to realize there was absolutely no relevance to the case, and we could have got what we needed from the machine translation. The other thing to mention is that this demand is only going to grow. We've seen that the volumes of data is growing. We've seen that increasingly this is going to be multilingual. So the demand for this translation is only going to grow. And I think that's why legal has always been one of the kind of more lucrative industries, lucrative verticals in the translation industry, because the demand is there and often it can be quite high. And then the last thing to say is, firms are lucky that the demand is growing and the technology is there because the technology is only going to get better. It's only going to get more useful. So I showed the graph earlier on of how usable the translations were on our cases, and what I didn't show is obviously how that's changed from before, but suffice to say it's massively better, and that's only going to increase the amount that we can rely and kind of be kind of more assured that the machine translation is meeting the demands of this particular market. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Thanks very much for your attention. And so I'm going to hand the floor back to Alison and see if there are any questions that I'd be more than happy to answer for you.
Thanks a million, John. We do have a number of questions, and I will try to get to all of them. Just want to mention that if we don't, for some reason, get to everybody's question, we can pass those to John after the webinar, and if he has some time, can try to answer those for you. But you know, you talked about how this part of the business is growing, that it is a fundamental part of the tech stack and in the legal vertical. So I'm curious about some of the obstacles that you face when you're trying to sell your solution. So one of them obviously would be security, which you mentioned. You know, having an on-premise solution would be the extreme. But what about ensuring sensitive or confidential documents when they are in the cloud? Or so that's one example. Maybe you could talk about other obstacles that you hear from your potential customers or clients.
Yeah, so I mean, you touched on it there. Security is one of the biggest kind of issues that law firms will have, not only with machine translation, but with cloud services in general. So actually, from our perspective, the requirements, the burden of proof from our perspective to show that we are secure and demonstrate that is quite onerous. So I guess whether it's a small or a large case, typically the sales process or you know, the process that we go through to get up and running in production involves quite an intensive information security review. And this won't be new, I guess, to a lot of people listening who've worked with large enterprise clients. But suffice to say, when you're dealing in the legal industry, there is absolutely no stone left unturned. So if you say we delete data after we've processed it, we have to demonstrate that in multiple ways, and that can often require having, you know, there's certain certifications like SOC 2, where you are audited on your processes, that someone comes in and audits your processes over a period of time so that you can demonstrate that you have done things like this. And so, yeah, so that's, I mean, you know, someone might have taken a demo of our software and decided that it's great and it's fit for purpose, and they've done that in the space of a couple of days, and then an information security review will take 3 months. So that's the biggest hurdle, is just proving that. And obviously, the more you do that over time, the more of the documentation you have to hand, and the more kind of repeatable that information is. But unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be too much of a standard in terms of that information security review. So each firm might ask questions in slightly different ways, might require slightly different information from you. And so there is an overhead there. And that's where, you know, having specific people on our team who are tasked with security, maintaining our security, answering these questions is really important. So that's one of the biggest challenges that we have in terms of adoption and in terms of getting our software up and running in this industry.
Okay, super, thanks. Kind of spinning off of that, are there other use cases for what Iconic is doing? You know, so either in the legal sector or in other verticals. I seem to recall talking with you about, you know, expanding services into different verticals. But what you've built here, can you give us any other use cases where it's been?
Yeah, so this is quite self-contained. So like, as a company, we work in different verticals. So we work in intellectual property, we work in legal, we work in pharmaceutical, life sciences. So this is essentially the legal use case. And it's kind of a very standalone product. The intellectual property use case, which was one of our early ones, it's not tremendously dissimilar to this. The use case there is, you know, you want to file an invention, or you want to file a patent, and you need to make sure that you're not infringing on anyone else's patent globally, which means you need to search all patents and make sure that you're not infringing on them. But a lot of those patents are in Chinese and Japanese and Korean and things like that. So that's a really common use case. But I mentioned more towards the beginning that the growing set of use cases that we see for machine translation that we're working in. So in the life sciences industry, this is another similar to, I wouldn't be surprised if in a few months' time we could have a very similar kind of end-to-end solution for life sciences, like I've just described here for litigation and e-discovery. So there are cases around pharmacovigilance in terms of multilingual clinical trials where machine translation is beginning to be used. I guess more in traditional localization industries, or where localization has been more prevalent, like information technology. Customer support is a massive one. So the volume of content that companies are generating, being able to get that out in multiple languages to a broader audience and speak to potential clients in their languages is growing. And then, once clients are on board, being able to support them. So this notion of real-time multilingual customer support, where perhaps rather than having a Spanish-speaking customer support and Japanese-speaking customer support and Chinese, that you have a single or a smaller, English-speaking customer support team, and machine translation is the interface there to ultimately kind of reduce the turnaround times and potentially the cost as well of multilingual customer support. There's some really growing use cases and verticals for machine translation that we have seen and have been operating in over the last number of years as well.
Okay, super. There are a couple of questions that are all kind of under the same umbrella, so I'm going to try to paraphrase a few of them. But essentially, I wonder if you could give us a sense of where Iconic fits into kind of the translation and localization industry ecosystem. So from a business perspective. So for example, you just gave us a bunch of other use cases. So you're not just serving the legal sector, but who are your competitors? Do you license your technology to service providers so that they can offer it to their customers? If you can approach maybe a little bit more your business model side of.
I guess so the main thing that I mentioned at the beginning is we're a technology provider. So one of the things we're not doing and don't necessarily have an intention of doing in the medium term is the service side of things. So offering human translation as a service. So there have been other machine translation providers who have kind of evolved into that. That's not something that we do. So I guess many of the use cases that I just described to you answering the last question are kind of what we deem as MT only use cases. So there's actually not a human translation requirement. So many kind of forms of localization where machine translation is involved, there's a post-editing step involved in that. And so we do that in a lot of cases, but a lot of the use cases that we do are machine translation only. So like what I just described there, that's a very obvious machine translation only use case because we're dealing with massive volumes that need to be turned around in a short space of time. There is a human component somewhere towards the end, but we're not taking care of that bit. We're taking care of the machine part. So, I mean, from a competitive perspective, anyone who offers translation is a competitor of ours because we do translation as well. And so it's machine translation providers, online machine translation. And so it's a case of, how we are differentiating ourselves is by focusing on specific use cases. So if you think of the two types of machine translation, there's general purpose machine translation, and then there's domain specific machine translation. And the way to improve upon general machine translation is by focusing in on a specific vertical, on a specific use case. And that's really where our focus is. So we're not trying to do what Google Translate can do, because Google Translate does that well. It does any type of content, any language, to quite a reasonable standard. But if you want to improve upon that, then you need to do something different. And that can be focusing on the specific needs of a specific set of clients in specific industries. And so obviously, as you can see, those 6 steps that I showed here were how we have really focused on the specific needs of making machine translation usable in this use case for the legal industry. We are doing similar things in some of the other industries that I mentioned as well. And so to the point of, and so our business model is broadly the same across those industries. There's if there's a customization or bespoke development of an engine, there's a kind of a services cost for that. And after that, it's all subscription based on the volume of content that's processed. Specifically to the point about, do we license to LSPs? In some cases, yes, but generally speaking, not that often, because LSPs are typically covering a variety of different content types and a variety of different clients and use cases, and it can be quite fragmented. And so to be able to have a single machine translation solution that covers all of those bases is very difficult, and it's exactly the opposite of what I described we're trying to achieve. So when we do work with language service providers, it tends to be on a specific client project, and as a kind of a trifecta, if you will. So we're not, white labeled behind the LSP. We are working with the LSP to service a particular client, and the LSP takes care of the services side, the post-editing side, the QA side, and we take care of the technology development side. And in those cases, so we've evolved into that based on our experiences over the lifetime of the company, and what has worked and what hasn't worked. And so that is what we found as the kind of the recipe for success with LSP. So if the LSP says, I would like to have machine translation as a tool in my arsenal to service all of my different clients across their languages and content types, that's not really something that fits our offering. However, if an LSP comes and says, I have a client who works in a specific industry and has a specific use case, and I'd like to bring machine translation into our workflow with them, then that's an area where we do work.
Okay, super. That's helpful, and I think you kind of covered, like I said, the number of questions that were coming at that from that angle. So, a couple of other questions that are fairly specific to your solution. One of them is about the file formats, and you mentioned having to figure out, 40 plus. Does your machine translation engine itself accept 40 plus file formats natively?
For the most part, yeah, it accepts a lot of them to varying degrees of success. So, I mean, you asked, the first question that was asked was about the kind of the blockers or the challenges. So, to, I guess, adoption, and which I mentioned was security. The biggest challenge, once something is in production, the biggest challenge is the variety of file formats, especially proprietary file formats. So, we aim to have parsers to handle all of the different file formats. Some of them, it's just a case of getting the text out and producing a translation in text format. We'll try to preserve the format in format types where that's possible. And there are some formats that we do handle, but the success rate would be lower. So yeah, it's an attempt to try and cover all of the bases, like with anything. Obviously, certain file formats are much more prevalent than others. So there are a subset of all those file formats that we focus on, but there are other ones that we aim to support as well, like I said, to varying degrees of success.
Great. Thank you. And then I think one final question, folks, if you have any others, please type them in now. We're approaching the end of the webinar. The last question otherwise is, maybe you could talk a little bit about the integration component that you mentioned as one of your differentiators, or one of the maybe reasons that a legal team would want to work with Iconic as opposed to some of the free stuff. Does the technology integrate with the translation side of things, like translation management systems or CAT tools, or is it really only with the clients? You mentioned relativity as one.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, I mean, at the core of everything, we have an API. And so most of the time in the legal industry, you're not dealing with tech companies, don't have software teams. So they're not going to develop a connector to your API into their workflow. They're using a set of tools and they want to know, are you in that? And so it's a case of saying, okay, what tools do the law firm use? Do the law firms use? Let's develop connectors for them. So outside of that, in more on the translation side of things, more of our enterprise clients do connect directly to our API because they might have proprietary workflows, and they obviously have the resources to do software engineering. So they might just say, yeah, let's take your API, let's take your SDK, and we will develop a connector to it directly. But then aside from that, yeah, so from our perspective, being connected into the localization workflow means having connectors to CAT tools and to translation management systems. And we have a number of them, like the usual ones like Studio and MemoQ and WordFast and things like that. And then with kind of various TMSs as well. And there are some that we have in development. There are some where, we've spoken to a TMS provider and it's a case of saying, we don't have a mutual client yet, but when we do, we'll get the connector in place. So that's really the way we like to frame that, as well as is things like that are engineering challenges as opposed to scientific challenges. So the scientific challenge is getting machine translation technology that's good enough. And that's really, really hard. And that's kind of ultimately what we hang our hat on as a company. Anything else is engineering, and that's never a blocker to getting something. So if we have a connector, which we try to do for the most part for kind of the main tools, then brilliant. If not, then it tends to be just a case of getting one developed.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. I think that's all the questions that we have now. If you have any others that you think of, please go ahead and type them in, and we'll see if John can answer them offline at some point. But thank you, everybody, for submitting those. John, thank you again for joining us today and presenting on this topic. And another big thank you to all of our participants for joining us. I have a few closing words, but John, any final words from you?
Just to say thanks to yourselves at GALA for having me on your webinar series again, and thanks to everyone for attending. You can see some contact details on the screen there, so feel free to reach out to me if you have any follow-up questions that you'd like me to address. Thank you.
Thanks. And we would appreciate it if you all could take just a moment to give us your feedback on today's session using the post-event survey. It's quite short, just a couple of questions, and your perspectives help us to refine the webinar program and our offerings. So with that, I will wish you a good day or a good night, depending on where you are, and we'll look forward to seeing you at another GALA webinar soon. Thank you and goodbye.